Right here in front of me I have the Nikon Z8 and Canon R5 II, and these are two of the best options that you can have for wildlife or bird photography. And these two cameras, even though they're from different manufacturers, actually share many characteristics but also have their distinct own advantages and disadvantages. And I think for most people it doesn't make sense to switch system just because there's a feature that the R5 II has that the Nikon Z8 doesn't, or the other way around. However, if you're looking into a new investment, maybe you're switching from another manufacturer, I think it's worth having a closer look at these two cameras, because there's some very specific things that I really enjoy or hate about one or the other camera. In this video, I don't want to compare the spec sheets of the two cameras because I think that's pretty useless. You can do this on your own, but I was shooting a lot with both cameras and I just want to talk about my real-world experiences and what it means for us as wildlife photographers. So both of these cameras have a lot of common characteristics. They are both not the top of the line camera. There is the Nikon Z9 and the Canon R1 that also have the integrated battery grip, that offer dual CF Express Type B card slots, whereas these two only offer one CF Express and one SD slot. And the list goes on, but what they also share is a 45 megapixel stacked sensor, and all this combination together with the magnesium alloy body that is quite weather resistant makes both cameras very interesting choices for wildlife photographers. So the first important thing is of course the price of the camera. I remember when the cameras were announced in Switzerland, the R5 II was ever so slightly cheaper. However, the Z8 is a bit older now, so the price has dropped more than the one of the R5 II. And now the Z8 is cheaper. I checked the prices at the European Union. I will put the US dollars in a corner here. The Z8 currently costs around 3,900 euros, whereas the R5 II is around 4,800 euros. You can see that the body, although similar in the sense that it doesn't have an integrated battery grip and is a rather large body, there is still a difference. The Z8 is clearly the bigger camera, and this is already where it starts with personal preference, because some people prefer how the Z8 feels in their hands, whereas others prefer the R5. For me, it actually depends on which lens I'm using it with. If I'm using it with a 70-200, a wide-angle lens, 100-500, I clearly prefer the R5 II. However, if I'm using really the big guns like the 600mm f4, I almost prefer the Z8 because I have a bit more space for my pinky here. What you definitely notice when you pick these two cameras up is the difference in weight. The R5 II weighs around or a bit less than 750 grams, whereas the Nikon Z8 is at 910 grams. Both of the cameras, as I mentioned, have the same card slots, and I would highly recommend to use the CF Express Type B card on both cameras because it's just so much faster and actually also cheaper. We have a battery inside that is quite decent. The official number states something like 340 frames when using the electronic viewfinder until the battery dies. I wanted to stress that you cannot trust these numbers for mirrorless cameras, because if you shoot a lot of action, I managed with either of the cameras to get way over 1,000 shots. I think with the R5 II I managed something like 5,000 shots was my maximum. I feel like the R5 II has a better battery life than the Z8 overall. Nevertheless, with both cameras I would highly recommend to get at least 2 spare batteries so that you're not limited by battery life. In terms of the usability, they also share several things, like you have this shoulder display on top that I really like to quickly check my settings, because then I can keep the back screen off, which just saves some battery. We also have a digital mode dial or mode button to switch between the different shooting mode, like manual, aperture priority, shutter priority, and so on. Both have a joystick. If you shoot a lot of video and photo and you switch back and forth, I really prefer the position of the photo video switch of the Nikon Z8 that you can just reach with your thumb, whereas the one on the R5 II on the left hand side is a bit more annoying. On the other hand, if you want to quickly record a video, you can do so on the R5 II with just pressing one button, and it goes to a pre-configured, well, set of settings for shooting video. The Z8 doesn't have this function. There you always need to change into the video mode first. Both cameras have a joystick and a lot of buttons that can be customized in the menu. Overall, I would say the Z8 offers more customizability than the R5 Mark II. Not a huge difference, but it offers a bit more options. However, what I really like on the R5 Mark II is that we have 3 control wheels, which in my opinion should just be standard for every professional camera. Sony even has 4. Because this just means I can, if I'm shooting in manual mode, which I do all the time, I can use one wheel or dial for the shutter speed, one for aperture and one for ISO, and I'm super fast changing all these 3 parameters. On the Z8 I always need to press another button first if I want to change the ISO. And that's just annoying. It doesn't sound like a big deal, but it really slows me down in the field, and I have friends that shoot Nikon and actually say the same. And you cannot even reconfigure these dials or wheels somehow, that one of them would be for the ISO and maybe you give up on the aperture and only do the aperture via a press of a button. It's always shutter and aperture. You can just exchange which one is which, but you cannot completely reconfigure it. The next thing I want to mention is if we look on front here, you can see on both cameras that the actual sensor is kind of hidden. It's protected by a sensor shield. In the case of the R5 Mark II, this is just a mechanical shutter. The Z8 lacks a mechanical shutter and therefore has a dedicated sensor shield. And yes, this is actually an important difference. So I will turn both cameras on now. And you can see now, you can see the sensor, and just have a look how long it takes until the sensor shield or the mechanical shutter goes down. I will turn them off simultaneously. Okay, now the R5 Mark II is also down. You saw that the Z8 was instant. For the R5 Mark II it took maybe 3 seconds, and these 3 seconds can sometimes feel like an eternity if you're trying to switch lenses. So here I clearly prefer the setup from the Z8. It's very well done. The only annoying thing is if I go to the playback, the sensor shield is still going down. This makes a bit unnecessary amount of noise in my opinion. Let's have a look at the back of the camera. Let's start with the viewfinder. The Z8 actually has a larger magnification of 0.8 versus the 0.76 on the R5 Mark II. However, the R5 Mark II has a resolution of around 5.7 million dots, whereas the Z8 has one of 3.8 million dots. And you can see the difference, both in magnification and in resolution. The image of the R5 Mark II, I would say, looks more natural, cleaner, less digital. However, this one of the Z8 is really bigger. So I think here it comes down again to personal preference. I can work with both viewfinders just fine. What is really nice with both viewfinders anyway is that they are blackout free. So if you are taking a burst of shots and you are tracking a bird in flight, the camera doesn't have a blackout, or you will never have like a slideshow effect or a black image. You will always see the live feed, and this makes it so much easier if you're basically tracking rather erratic flying birds. Just below we have a rear screen that is 3.2 inches in diagonal for both cameras with a similar resolution. The biggest difference I think is the way it tilts or swifts or whatever. Basically the one of the R5 you can see you put to the side, and then you can put it up, down, or even in front if I want to take a picture of myself, or I'm filming myself right now. What I also enjoy is that I can actually put it inside, so it's actually protected against potential knocks or scratches, and it also saves battery. On the Z8 this is not possible. We can only put it out, like up, down, and then a bit down in vertical or more up in vertical shooting. For photography this has always been enough for me. It's not ideal if you want to film yourself. And one big advantage of this mechanism is clearly that if you are trying to take pictures of some birds on the water, some ducks or something, you can quite easily shoot basically over the optical axis, so it makes it much quicker to find your subject on the display. Let's go quickly back to the viewfinder, because there's an important or cool feature that the R5 Mark II has, and that's the eye-controlled autofocus when using the viewfinder. Basically your eye is scanned and the camera kind of analyzes where you're looking at, and then if you press a specific button you can move the autofocus field, and if you want also immediately start autofocus metering wherever you look by eye. And I was a bit skeptical, but it works surprisingly well. It's not perfect, it's not the most accurate way of moving the autofocus field around, but it's definitely the fastest. It's so much faster than using the joystick or something, even if you increase the sensitivity of the joystick. So it's a cool feature. However, obviously it only works if you're using the viewfinder. It works best if you really have the camera close by and not in a kind of weird position. And to be honest, the animal eye detection autofocus, so where the camera is looking for a subject to detect, works so well on both cameras that I don't need to move the autofocus area around as much as I needed to maybe 5 or 8 years ago. So talking a bit more about the autofocus of both cameras, as mentioned, they have this subject detection, but there are some differences. For example, the Canon R5 Mark II has one mode for all kind of animals, whereas the Z8 has a different ones for like different types of animals, and bird animal eye detection is a specific function. And I realized that while there is an automatic mode, the automatic mode doesn't work as well as if you directly put it to bird or animal eye detection. So with the Nikon Z8 I still need to switch around a bit. With the R5 there is only an animal category, no specific bird category, so this makes it a bit quicker. Basically in the setup I can leave it always on animals. In general, when it comes to detecting subjects, both do a good job. Nikon really improved the Z8 a lot via firmware updates. However, the R5 Mark II is clearly better at detecting the subjects, especially if they're small in frame. The R5 Mark II is maybe the best, together with the R1, maybe the best camera on the market at the moment, in my opinion. However, once the camera has kind of acquired the lock on the subject, both of the cameras are tracking the subject very reliably. Also, if it's moving quickly, if it's flying, the bird is flying directly towards you, or if the bird is for a few, like for a short time behind some bushes or other obstacles, both cameras do a good job. In my opinion, the Z8 performs a bit better in backlight. There, especially if it's a really harsh backlight with a lot of flares, I feel like the R5 Mark II is struggling a little bit more. And in general, I feel like the setup of the Z8 in terms of autofocus is a bit more complicated, and I tend to switch the options, or like tend to use different autofocus fields a bit more, whereas with the R5 Mark II I basically use 2 autofocus options for 98% of the shooting. And if you want to learn more about the autofocus system of both cameras, how you can configure it, then please check out my ebooks. I wrote one about Nikon Z cameras and their autofocus system, how to set it up, when to adapt it to different situations, together with my friend Nicolas Stettler. And I also wrote one for the Canon R5 Mark II and Canon R1 by myself, also based on my experiences, which settings I recommend, and so on. There is a money-back warranty in case you would not be satisfied with the ebook. So let's move to the main thing of the camera, and this is the sensor. So first of all, both have an in-camera body image stabilization. Basically, the sensor can move around with different axes, or move around different axes to compensate for camera shake or any movement that could result in a blurry image. And the Canon R5 has a better rating of up to 8.5 exposure values in the center of the image, whereas the Z8 is just rated at 6. However, I feel like this benefit of the R5 Mark II is really more in the center of the image. I felt this already when I upgraded from the R5 to the R5 Mark II, that the corner performance didn't improve as much as the center. So in reality, I didn't feel like it was a huge difference between these two cameras. And when you're shooting in video mode, I still think that the Nikon Z8 has an advantage. It's just a more stable image that you can use more easily afterwards. One thing that I want to mention, however, with the IBIS is that there is a difference in terms of the noise level. At least I'm pretty sure it's the IBIS. So when I turn the camera on, the Z8 stays silent. On the R5 Mark II we hear some noise. In the beginning I was not sure if it's the fan or the IBIS, but it stops after a few seconds, and then when I press the shutter or AF on button again, it starts to kick in again. So I think it's probably the IBIS. It's not a deal breaker. I didn't never spook an animal away, but you can notice it, especially if you're sitting in a quiet environment and you just have the camera running. As mentioned in the beginning of the video, both cameras have a 45 megapixel stacked sensor. 45 megapixel is of course plenty of resolution in case you want to crop a bit, provided that the conditions are good enough that you can actually crop. In terms of image quality, I don't think there is a big difference in terms of noise, details, dynamic range, or colors. There are some subtle differences, but in my opinion, really not so important. I cannot imagine one situations where I was shooting with the Z8 and was like, oh, I wish I had the image quality of the R5 Mark II now, or the other way around. So let's just leave it at that. What I did realize, however, was that even though both of them are stacked sensors and should therefore minimize rolling shutter, in some situations, really rare situations, but still, the R5 Mark II still had some small artifacts on the wings of birds, usually not swans or herons or ducks that were taking off, but really smaller birds like songbirds in flight. It was not bad, you need to zoom in a lot that you can see it, but it's still there. It's much improved compared to the Canon R5 that didn't have a stacked sensor, but I still have the feeling the Z8 still has a bit a quicker readout that avoids this problem entirely. Both of these cameras can be set to a minimum shutter speed of 1/32,000th of a second, which is nice if you're shooting in rather harsh light, want to include some bokeh in the background with a fast lens like an f2.8 lens, or maybe even f1.8 lens like the 135mm. There is a significant difference in the burst rate of the two cameras, so the Nikon Z8 offers 20 frames per second, whereas the R5 Mark II offers 30 frames per second. And in many situations this doesn't matter at all. Of course, if you have a perched bird, even 20 frames per second is overkill. If I have like a heron, a stork, I don't know what other animal flying by, I also think 20 frames per second is more than enough. However, if you have kingfishers in flight, songbirds in flight, swallows or swifts in flight, I'm really happy about having a bit more options to choose from in terms of wing position, background, and so much more that just can go wrong with flight shots. So there the R5 Mark II is a big advantage. However, what I noticed immediately, basically after the first day of using the R5 Mark II, is that the buffer is not the best. So the buffer basically specifies how long you can take pictures with your camera before it starts slowing down or stops shooting altogether. And I don't like to just test how many seconds can I shoot until the camera slows down, because cameras behave quite differently. Nikon has a very pleasant way basically of reaching the buffer. It just gets a bit slower, but it continues shooting. The R5 Mark II, on the other hand, it kind of stops once it hits the buffer. It's like a hard buffer and the camera is blocked for a few seconds, which is a bit annoying. So what I did instead is I thought, what's the longest sequence of shot that I ever needed to record? Like if I had some fighting coots or maybe two birds in air that were fighting with each other. And I think I never exceeded 20 seconds. Again, for normal flight shots, I have far less. I have maybe 2 seconds or something, but for these fighting scenes or courtship behavior, it might be. So I first started with the uncompressed RAW. Obviously, I was writing to the CF Express Type B card, and then I just held down the shutter for 20 seconds and counted how many frames the camera takes. So with 20 frames per second on the Z8, a theoretical maximum would be 400 frames. With the R5 Mark II, it would be 600. In reality, the Z8 got around 360 or so quite close to the 400. However, the R5 Mark II got only, I think, 260 frames. So not only was it far off the theoretical 600 it could reach, it was actually shooting less in these 20 seconds than the Nikon Z8 that is only doing 20 frames per second. And this is just because the buffer filled up very quickly. I think after 5 seconds the camera was already slowing down or stopping for a few seconds. Then I switched to C-RAW on the Canon R5 Mark II and on the Z8 on the high efficiency Star RAW, because on both cameras I took 10,000s, maybe 50,000s of photos, and all of them basically in C-RAW, high efficiency Star. And there the Z8 easily reached the 400 shots in 20 seconds. The R5 Mark II was nowhere close to the 600, but at least it managed around 350 shots, I believe. I will put the exact number on top. So here it was like for the first 8 seconds or so, the R5 Mark II is clearly an advantage because you can shoot 30 frames per second. But for longer sequences, you can ultimately get more images with the Z8. I think overall I would still give the point to the R5 Mark II, because in most situations I think in 8 seconds the action is over, and until I think 10 seconds or so the R5 Mark II is leading clearly. But still, it would have been nice if Canon would have just put a bigger buffer in the R5 Mark II. Finally, for action photography, sometimes it happens so quickly that we just miss the moment. And for these situations, it's very nice to have this pre-capture or pre-burst or pro-capture, however it's called, with different manufacturers. And both cameras have it, but unfortunately the Z8 only in JPEG, and therefore I never really used it. The R5 Mark II offers it in full RAW or the compressed RAW as you want. You can select how many frames of pre-capture you should take. The maximum is 15 frames, which if you set it to 30 frames per second is half a second. This was for me always more than enough. I actually even dialed it down a little bit. So this can really be a game changer for some images, because these are just some shots that I would have missed with the Z8 in some situations. However, I also want to stress that these are very rare occasions where this happens, because in most situations if there is action and I miss it, I don't miss it because I'm too slow pressing the shutter. I'm missing it because I'm focusing on one bird and I see like out of my eye, like on my peripheral view, on the other side there is a bird taking off or doing something cool. Or maybe I was not focused, like the lens was not focused on the bird, it was focused on something else, whatever. In all these situations, pre-burst is not helping at all. So just keep this in mind. It's a very nice feature for a few very selected occasions, and for 95 or 98% of my shooting, I actually have it deactivated on the R5 Mark II because it just uses more battery and fills up the card quite quickly. And regarding the buffer, I also tested different CF Express Type B cards, and from my experience there was no difference no matter which CF Express Type B cards I used. I used different manufacturers with different writing speeds, so it seems as the camera are not supporting the fastest cards. I mean, they work, but they don't benefit from them. So I would, if you buy a CF Express for one of these two cameras, not spend the money on the fastest card that you can get, because you will not feel a difference in terms of writing speed in the camera. Both cameras are not just excellent choices for still shooting, but also for videos. However, I don't feel competent enough to really judge which one is better here. I have just some features that I like on each of the cameras. Like on the R5 Mark II, we have the pre-recording in video as well that can be set to 3 or even 5 seconds. On the other hand, the Z8 has this neat little option that you can change like a crop mode just by press of one button, which is not possible with the R5 Mark II. So there is ups and downs to both, and if you're interested into video, I just recommend that you watch another channel from a guy or a woman that focuses more on video. So overall, I think both of these are really good choices for wildlife photography, and if you're not happy with your results, it's probably not the camera. Maybe you set it up the wrong way. Again, I have the autofocus ebook if you're curious about that, or you just need to do something else with your technique, with approaching birds whatsoever. If I would need to pick a winner, it would be the Canon R5 Mark II, and hear me out before you say I'm a Canon fanboy. Like 1.5 years ago, when the Z8 and the R5 were out, I would have said that the Z8 was actually the better camera. So I think it's just logical. The R5 Mark II is newer. It wins in this sense. It has more features. I think it's the overall all-rounder package, the better all-rounder, but both of them are excellent cameras. I linked them below, as I mentioned, especially if the Z8 you can benefit that the price has dropped over the last few years. Let me know what you think about these two cameras, and then see you in the next video.